Hello, this is Monica Volkmar. You're listening to Movement Detectivery. I'm recording outside, and it's a bit of a windy day here in Melbourne, so apologies if the wind comes through. Today, I am doing an episode where it's just me talking, and in the spirit of Movement Detectivery, I thought it would be cool for you guys, hopefully, to hear a few cases that I thought were pretty cool that I had the opportunity of working with this week in my practice. Something that I think is a really interesting connection is between, as a craniosacral therapist, this is interesting to me, but the connections between the mouth, the hard palate, and the way that adaptations here have an effect on the whole body in motion and can manifest as symptoms in different parts of the body that you might not suspect are coming from the mouth. Who would have thought? But in these two cases I wanted to share today, both of them had a history of appliances in their mouth of different types, and they both have very different types of body pain, not related to their mouth, or rather, the symptoms weren't their mouth, and they showed up very differently in spite of having a very similar pattern through their mouth. So let's get into it. My first one, we'll call her JJ, not her real name. So JJ came with a complaint about her eyes, interestingly, eye strain. And her complaint was when she was lying in bed at night, she'd feel this massive sense of her eyes getting pulled downward, like the actual eyeball rolling downward towards her feet, and it felt really uncomfortable and like a lot of pressure. And she just, whenever she would meditate, she's a bit of a yoga practitioner and meditator, and whenever she'd sit to meditate, she'd notice her eyes just getting pulled down, and it was not very pleasant for her. And she also had a bit of a left shoulder complaint. In her words, it felt dicky. So, interestingly, in her history, and this showed up as I was working on her, she has a history of when she was young, a lot of her teeth actually got knocked out. And poor woman, she was teased in school because she had one front tooth and the rest of her teeth were knocked out. And at that time, I mean, she's a bit older now, so they didn't have the means to give her a set of false teeth. And now she wears a denture that's just on her upper palate. So it's like a domed metal, probably titanium appliance that sits on her hard palate, so it fixes into her maxilla and it has teeth on it, and she has nothing in her lower jaw for dentures, but her upper palate has a denture in it. And I had a look at it, and it's really cool. It's very specifically molded to match the shape of her hard palate, and she's had this thing for years. I don't know how many, but I gotta say 5-10 years at least that she's had this thing in. Anyway, so I was doing a bit of cranial work with her. Through cranial assessments and listening techniques, I was drawn to work with her skull. And specifically, I got sucked towards her sphenoid. And as some of you may know, the sphenoid is of interest in this case because most of the muscles that connect to the eyeball for its movement connect to the sphenoid bone, which sits in the middle of the cranium and forms part of the back of the eye socket. The orbit of the eye, part of it is formed by the sphenoid bone. So my hands being drawn there, I thought, this is quite interesting. I held the sphenoid, waited for it to move, encouraged a gentle decompression, and I could sense that it just didn't want to go. Like, it wanted to, but it just wasn't going to. Not happening, not keen on moving. I should backtrack and say that some of the assessments dynamically we did with her were of her neck. We did a keeping the eyes fixed on the horizon and moving her head up and down. This is a movement that in the gait cycle we need to be able to move the skull freely in 3 dimensions but have the eyes fixed straight ahead on the horizon. So it's a bit of a way of assessing the movement of the eyeballs and the neck together in concert. to see if they're able to oppose each other like we'd like to in gait. And she expressed it was very challenging to go chin down, so a neck flexion, while leaving her eyes on the horizon, which is a need to move the eyeballs upward. So a rolling up of the eyeballs, or a posterior roll of the eyeballs while her skull anterior tilts. So interesting that she says her eyeballs always feel like they're getting pulled downwards, and that movement of her eyeballs rolling upwards was a bit challenging for her. So anyway, back to what I was feeling in my hands. As I was holding her sphenoid and getting the sense of, something feels like it's blocking her sphenoid from being able to liberate itself from whatever this stuck position is. And I got drawn energetically deeper towards her mouth. And this is when she tells me about her denture she's wearing. And I ask her, that's interesting. Could you maybe take that out and see if it changes the mobility of your sphenoid? So she takes it out, and she tells me she's quite self-conscious without it in. And she always wears it, even when she's at home by herself. Anyway, immediately, there's much more movement in her sphenoid. So, knowing there is a bit of a direct connection from the maxilla to the sphenoid via a bone called the vomer, which sits on top of the maxilla and sits directly anterior of the sphenoid, I thought, could this hard palate appliance be creating a blockage that's preventing the inherent motion of the sphenoid and thus affecting her eyes? And this is just a hypothesis. I like to think about why things are the way they are, even if it's true. So I thought, well, we better confirm this hypothesis, and let's check out what's happened with her maxilla and see if it's just been stuck in a position for a while. So we do a couple of intraoral techniques to free up any restriction in the maxilla and the vomer. And what's really interesting is it felt like there was quite a significant shearing sideways of her maxilla to the right, and a rotation of her maxilla to the right. And same with the vomer, which sits right on top of the maxilla and forms the septum of the nose. It was also sheared and rotated to the right. So these were able to free themselves up a little bit with some encouragement, and then I knew I was a little upset. Upset's not the right word, but internally I knew she was going to go back and put in her denture, and the shape of her denture was formed perfectly for the shape of her mouth, in that maxilla and vomer sheared and rotated to the right state. And my concern was that, well, you'll put the denture back in, that'll throw your pattern right back where it started, and you might get nowhere. Same with if you have a pair of shoes that are keeping your feet stuck in a pattern because you've been wearing that same shoes for 5 years, and then you have a really lovely experience getting new mobility and capacity in your feet. You put the shoes back on and it just sets you back off on your pattern you had for the past 10 years or 5 years due to where the shoes move your feet into again and may restrict any new motion from happening. So I expressed this to her. I said, how do you feel about maybe wearing your denture less? And she didn't want to, really, but I asked her, maybe when you're just at home, spend less time with it in and just observe. See how it feels in your body. Because we had got her to stand up and then check back in with her head movement, and she said, it feels a lot more free. My upper back feels a lot more movable, a lot less restricted. Left shoulder feels a little bit better. Everything feels an improvement. And, people are going to do what they're going to do. I myself, as much as I know that there are some things that I shouldn't do with my body, with my rational mind, we all have things we're self-conscious about that may cause us to do things that are not really in our greatest interest. So for her, she's so self-conscious about having only one front tooth, and I would be too. I'd probably be like, hell no, I'm not going to just go around with one front tooth. I mean, I thought she looked super cute, like really adorable with just her one front tooth, but she didn't feel the same way. And then, very interestingly, the last time that I saw her, she came in and she didn't have her denture in. And I was like, oh, that's cool. She's not wearing her denture today. I wonder if she's had a change of mind. And she tells me, my denture broke and I'm going to have to get a new one. And for me, I said, well, it's amazing that you're here today. When are you getting your denture? She says, I'm getting it on Monday. And this was a Saturday. So I'm like, well, this is great. We're going to do a bit of work then and see how your mouth feels today. Is there any asymmetry, any restriction that we can maybe move into a more centered state? And then when you get your denture fitted, your new denture, then it'll have maybe more of an ideal position for your mouth. It won't be throwing you back into the state that you were in before. And I haven't seen her since then. So I have no idea. I'll give you an update when I see her again. This was maybe a few months ago. Maybe she feels great and hasn't felt the need to come back, so I'll have to check in with her again and see. But I'm very curious to see if she's had a new denture fit, if she's feeling like her eye strain has reduced, if her neck range of motion feels like it's improved. But I thought that was such a cool example of a long-term appliance in the mouth that was restricting some movement within her cranium, which could have been affecting her eyes and even her neck, and thus down further into her shoulder and probably even her hips, which were starting to become more and more level and comfortable as we worked on her mouth. So to be continued, that story. My second person, who is also a bit of an interesting maxilla and vomer case, we'll call her Elizabeth. So Elizabeth, I see when she has some problems on and off, and I've been working with her for a year now or so, because I started seeing her in Melbourne when I began practicing again. And she was having some gnarly left hip pain. So her pain was at the front of her left hip, and it was uncomfortable when she shifted her pelvis to the left, and it was uncomfortable when she rotated her left femur externally, so a hip external rotation on the left. So anything opening the anterior left hip and weight bearing into it was not very pleasant. Interestingly, her position of her body at rest puts her into a left hip external rotation. So she had a pelvis rotated to the left. She had a right pelvis hiked, and her weight was primarily distributed over center of mass over her right foot. So those of you who study anatomy and motion, that combination puts her in what would be a more ease, stepping forward onto the right leg, more ease into a right suspension, left propulsion phase, more ease with the right femur internally rotating, more ease with the left femur externally rotating. So very interesting that her left hip was stuck in a left external rotation, or left hip external rotation, and her weight primarily on her right leg as her dominant weight-bearing leg, and it was painful to put her weight into her left leg to be weight-bearing. So a bit of history for her as it relates to why her mouth was of interest was she wore a palate expanding appliance when she was young, and I think she had not a pleasant experience with it. It wasn't super comfortable. She didn't like it, and she can't even remember why she had it. So we had to look up why someone would wear it, and it was due to tooth crowding, but she can't really remember the details of it because she was so young. So here we go on what we did together. As part of my assessment process, I like to use a listening technique, which is something that I have learned through studies with the Burrell Institute, which is essentially placing your hands on the body and feeling into where the lines of tension are leading you to. It's a bit touchy-feely and a bit subjective, but I've learned to trust my abilities with it. And where it led me in my listening was to her front of her face. And I thought, that's interesting. She has left hip problems. Why am I listening to her face? Let's trust it. As we've been taught in the Barral Institute, listen to the tissues and trust the tissues, because their body knows better than what my mind might concoct as a story. And I think something I get easily sucked into still, even though I know I shouldn't, is I chase symptoms, and I'm very easily swayed by a person's complaint of my left hip hurts, and I think, okay, let's work on her left hip. But this time I was like, no, I'm listening to her mouth. Something's going on here. I know she has a history with her palate, so let's just see, maybe something's connected here. So we do a movement assessment. It hurts her to shift her pelvis to the left. It hurts to weight bear into her left leg, and it's uncomfortable to externally rotate her left hip. So in a craniosacral session, I, again, am drawn into her maxilla. And so I have a feel at, well, is there any restriction here? And she as well, Elizabeth, has a sense of a rotation and a shear through her maxilla to the right, just like our previous client, JJ. So I thought, that's interesting. I let that unwind the way it wanted to and come back to a better sense of center. There was also a sense of a very difficulty expanding through the maxilla, which would make sense with her need for a palate expander early in life. I then checked in with her vomer because I was still getting some vibes about something in the hard palate ain't right. And again, her vomer was sheared and rotated to the right. As I'm doing this, Elizabeth expresses something about, I feel that in my left hip quite a bit. And I'm like, very interesting. After we do some work with her mouth, I listen again and see what her system is saying. And in a good case, if you do work in a place that needed it, your listening will be different and you'll be drawn to a different part of the body. And lo and behold, now we're drawn to her hip, the front of her left hip. And what it felt like was that as I was working around her hip, there was a sense of her inguinal ligament, the ligament that's across the front of the hip. It felt that was where I was getting drawn to and sunk into, and it felt stretched and needed to be put short again, which would make sense with that position of her hip. That external rotation of the hip would put tension across that inguinal ligament area. So I was very curious about how this potentially, from a young age, this position, this deviation to the right of her palate, could that have shifted her center of mass over time to the right? And it might seem crazy, but these things happen, that over time a small part of the body that has been shifted in one direction to the right over time could draw the entire spine, the entire pelvis, the center of mass of the body more over to the right and make her a lot more comfortable stepping onto her right leg and putting her into that right suspension pattern where her left hip would be more comfortable accessing external rotation. And then over time, you reach a point where, that's enough. I'm done. And to add to it, she had been doing ballet classes as a new activity, which, as you may know, is heaps of hip external rotation. And that could have just been the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say, just one bit of load too far for that inguinal ligament. And interestingly, once we got her up, she looked a lot more centered with where her pelvis was. She was able to shift her pelvis to the left, and she said, it doesn't hurt anymore, but I'm still hesitant. There was probably still some residual tenderness in that hip area and need for that ligament just to chill out for a bit before really stressing it again. But it's something that we'll never really know if the maxilla being drawn to the right over many, many years, if that was the pattern that led her body to be in that position, that put strain down into her inguinal ligament with that right suspension, left propulsion pattern being dominant in her system. And in a future session with her, we'll want to work on those mechanics to make sure that maybe her body will always be as a just her default will be, she'll be susceptible to being drawn into her right leg as her path of least resistance, and we'll want to make her resilient to also being able to weight bear into her left leg. And so this is what we worked on last time I saw her, was a left suspension phase, which was getting her to flex and internally rotate, flex into her left hip and internally rotate the femur and adduct that hip and really put some slack into that inguinal ligament and load up some glutes and get her body weight over her left leg. And she found it very, very challenging. And we observed that, wow, this is a position that your hip never gets into. So it might need a bit of reinforcing, and we might need just to keep checking in with your maxilla and make sure that it is all centered and the stresses of life aren't throwing you into a default pattern that then might show up in your left hip. But I thought it was really cool to make that connection. Again, we'll never really know if that is the truth of the situation or is it just pure mental masturbation. But at the end of the day, she felt better, and who knows? Is it all a big placebo? Sometimes I feel like just resting and being touched and having someone take care of you makes your pain feel a lot better, regardless of whether it was the real root cause of the problem. So I will always say that and caveat anything that I claim to have potentially done that helped is, I don't know, could have been placebo. Maybe it was just nice to have an interaction together and you feel seen and heard and thus better. Anyway, I thought those were cool things, and I certainly learned a lot from those two cases. If you've had an appliance, braces, dentures, teeth removed, oh my gosh, it can play havoc through the body over time, especially if it was something that happened as a child and then you've had decades to adapt around compensation patterns related to those things. So I would love to hear if you have a story about anything with your mouth, jaw, that you were able to track out to be related to another part of your body. That would be super cool to hear about. Shoot me a message, leave a comment somewhere. Shoot me an email. I would love to hear. And that'll be it for today. Thanks for tuning in to this solo episode of Movement Detectivery. Hope you have a great day and best of luck on your own movement explorations.